Hello guys, welcome to my YouTube channel. Valeton released a new update for the firmware and the software. In this tutorial, I'll be looking at how to install them and also what they added in this particular update. Let's get started. So over here you can see we have GP200, GP200X and then GP200R. That's the version of the board that has 8 buttons. I mean these 8 buttons. You are going to download the version 1.7.4 for the firmware, and then for the software you're going to download version 1.7.0. But if you are using the GP200JR and then GP200LT, you're going to download the version 1.7.0 for the firmware and version 1.7.0 for the software as well. Basically, to make a firmware update, the process is very simple. You simply have to first download the firmware and software. The second step is to unzip or extract the firmware and software. The third one is to install both firmware and then software. So basically these are the 3 steps that is involved in a firmware update or a software update. Irrespective of the version, these particular 3 steps isn't only limited to this version that we are going to install. If Valeton releases a new firmware another time in the future, you have to go through these same 3 steps and then you'll be fine. Let me show you how. First, you have to visit valeton.net. When you visit valeton.net, you see this page and it has a navigation bar over here. So we are going to go through the very first step, which is to download the firmware and then software. Every software update or every firmware update comes with a new manual. So the very first thing that we are going to have to download is the manual. So you have to hover over the support and come to download and then click the user manual. When you click the user manual, it will bring you to this particular page, and this is how it looks like. Because I am using the Valeton GP200, I hover over this, over the multi-effect, and then click GP200, and it will filter the list to show me only the GP200 version. So I'm going to download this for version 1.7.4. You have to be mindful of the version, and this process isn't only limited to Mac users. I use Mac, but the 3 steps still apply to every operating system that you're using. So I'm going to click this, save to download, and I'll save it in my downloads. So now that I'm done with the user manual, the next thing that I will download is the firmware. So I click that and it'll bring you to this particular page. I have to click list to filter the list, and you realize as I click other versions, you get to see the latest one at the very top. I'll choose this and then I'll hit download and it will start downloading. The next thing that we have to do is to come over to support again and then click software, and it will bring us to this particular page. Depending on the version that you're using, you have to filter and it will only show me the latest version for the one that I need. So version 1.7.0, just as the image said, it is compatible with version 1.7.0. That's the firmware update. So because I'm using Mac, I will click the Mac button. If you're using a Windows machine, you have to click Windows. That aside, one question that I keep receiving from Windows users is the fact that they are unable to record using the Valeton GP200 as a SoundCard, as I did in this particular video. So what you need to download and install as a driver is the ASIO, which is very important. So once you're on this particular page, you have to click this. For Windows users. For the Mac users, we don't need it unless you have modified your Mac and then it requires it. But by default, it works with the GP200. Once you plug and then you have the software installed, it would just run as it's supposed to. Now that we have downloaded all the required assets, the next step is to unzip all the files. By default, when you download the firmware and software, they come as a zipped file. So you have to use a file extractor to extract the files from the zipped file. So you can use softwares like WinRAR, and you can also use OnArchiver to extract the files. So if you're on Windows, you simply have to right click and then you see something like extract here or something like that. But on Mac, you simply have to double click this and it would unzip it. Same for the software. So you double click it and it will do that. So the very first thing that we need to do is to install the software. So over here, this is the setup for the Valeton GP200 software. Over here, you realize I have version 1.6.0. So I'm going to close that off and then double click this. So I simply have to go through the user agreement and then hit install. And then because I'm on Mac, I have to give permission for the installation. Now that the installation has been successful, we simply have to close this off. The next thing that I have to install is the firmware version 1.7.0. So one thing I noticed is we should have installed the firmware first. So I think that's the reason why we are getting request timeout. So over to GP200 series and I'll download version 1.6.0 for the Mac. Okay, so I'm going to unzip the software file. So I'm basically downgrading the software so that I can load the firmware. Then I install the new software, which is version 1.7.0. So because the version on the board matches that of what the software is expecting, that's why it has been able to open now. So let's fix the request timeout issue first. So I'll click the spanner icon and then click firmware update and then click this folder icon over here. And then I would go to the location where I have the unzip latest version. So it is expecting a .bin extension or file. So you have to choose the binary file and then click open. Once you do that, it will show you the path to where the firmware update is. And then you will see this button here, which is update now. But before you do any update, Valeton encourages you to back up your tones in case there's any mishap. You know you are covered. So I have already done that. So I'm going to click update now. So there's the caution like I mentioned, and you can click continue and continue again. This is what you are going to see on the board. And then on the software, this is how it looks like. Now let's go ahead and then install the latest version of the software. So I'm going to close this. So let's start the software. And because the board has what the software is expecting, everything should be fine. So let's try it out and see. And there we have it. Now we have everything. So I'm going to skip the tutorial because I'm very familiar with the software. And then click skip. So now we have the new firmware and then software update. And let's see what was added and what was removed. Okay, so with the software, these are the things that was added for the version 1.7.0. So they added the num file import function, and then they added firmware version 7.0. I think it's like a base version for all their boards. So if you have anything higher, relatively higher, I mean version 1.7.4, you can run the software and it will still work perfectly. So I'm going to close the software release notes, and then we'll look at the firmware release notes. So over here, they added the NumTone file import functionality with 5 loading slots each under the AMP, then the DST blocks or modules. This basically the only thing that they added, but it's a very huge game changer. So let's look at these things that was outlined in the release notes. So when you click the DST block, when you scroll to the very bottom, you see SnapTone, and it looks something like this. And let's check under the AMP block as well. So we have this 5 slots under these 2 blocks, the DST block and then the AMP or the AMP block. And then the AMP side looks basically like this. So in the next tutorial, I'll be delving deep into the NAP file and what it actually is. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button. See you next time.